Hi, in this video I will present Kuhn's concept of a paradigm. So as presented just before, Kuhn has this perspective on scientific development where normal science does happen, where science accumulates just like building a brick of Lego towers, one theory built on top of each other. But the particular thing about his perspective is this idea of a paradigm change. At some point, there will be challenges emerging in science that can't be solved with the existing paradigm, with the existing way of looking at things. And this is a kind of a crisis and requires a paradigm change. So in order to understand that, we need to get a good grasp of this concept of a paradigm, what does that actually mean? So crudely put, it's the fundamental assumptions that members of a scientific community accept. It's almost a little bit like the organizational culture concept. It's something implicit and taken for granted and not always reflected upon, but of course something that we can decipher and figure out. So Kuhn also says it's the entire constellations of beliefs, values, and techniques shared by members of a given community. So it's about how science is carried out. It's about what we consider is important and what fundamental assumptions are we building on. I'll give a couple of examples in just a second. So it's both the methods and techniques that we use to collect data and analyze data, but it's also some other kinds of more fundamental beliefs and also values. So what do we think is important? What should be funded? What's an important research question? And it's the members of a community that share it. It's how things are done in a given community. If you don't share this paradigm, you're not a member of that community. You're an outsider. So again, just to emphasize, a paradigm governs a group of practitioners, a group of researchers. It's not sort of a given subject field, whether it's quantum physics or supply demand or strategy. It's a group of people that are engaged in studying this, that share a common way of doing things, of talking about things, thinking about things, which can be good. It can make collaboration effective and communication effective, but it has some challenges. And it speaks to this issue of how we see the world and how we interpret whatever we see, as I talked about in the former video. And I think it's useful to use this Semmelweis example again about the mortality rate and where hand washing helped. So let's say you figure out that washing your hands at, I don't know, 30 degrees is better than 25 degrees. I'm just making this up. I don't know what is better. But that would be sort of a small change, maybe based on theoretical insight into what a germ actually is and how we can most effectively kill the most disease-prone germs. So that would be a small change that would be fairly easy for us to accept. If we are told nowadays in these COVID days that it's actually better to wash our hands with cold water rather than warm water or vice versa, it would be reasonably easy to accept because we already accept hand washing. We already accept what a virus is. But let's say that you were in the mid-19th century, in the 1840s, and you don't know that diseases are infected via germs. You simply don't have this fundamental assumption and insight. And then suddenly someone tells you that you need to wash your hands in order to make sure that the mothers that are about to give birth, they don't die in the birthbed. So if you don't have the fundamental assumption and paradigm, so to say, about what a germ is, it becomes very, very difficult for you to accept that hand washing works. You need the underlying insight and premise on what a germ is and how diseases can be transmitted from one person to another. And so that example quite nicely illustrates the point that smaller changes, of course, we can easily adapt to that. Kuhn is not saying that any kind of change is difficult to take in as a scientist. It's the big fundamental changes that just completely overthrows our usual way of seeing the world, which makes it difficult. So quite literally, again, using Kuhn's perspective, the researcher that is looking at this data is not seeing what Semmelweis is seeing. He's not able to take in the information and the data. He's not able to frame it in the way that allows him to say, yes, it was hand washing that made the difference. It had to have been something else, because hand washing would be magic. It wouldn't be theory. It wouldn't be science. So that's Kuhn's point here, that paradigms refer to something very basic, that it's very difficult for us to sort of shift away from. It's just like changing an organizational culture. It's also not something you can do from one day to another. Here I've tried to highlight sort of a few of the elements that Kuhn says are part of a paradigm. So just to help you get a better understanding of it. So he's highlighting these 4 different elements of a paradigm in his more detailed approach to it. So, for instance, we have symbolic generalizations. The supply-demand curve, for instance, is just sort of a very efficient way of communicating how the economic system works in our capitalistic society. Or we also have sort of a fundamental notion and paradigm about what a human economic actor is, at least in classical economics, pre-Kahneman, as we heard about the last time, about them being rational and just following incentives. We just need to give them information and money, and then they will shift their behavior. That was a fundamental assumption that could be very difficult to change for a researcher. It's also about value. So what questions do we want to pursue, but also to what degree do we, for instance, have to be able to predict the future as scientists? Or what can we just, so to speak, explain stuff? And should we do lab experiments or field experiments? Or what kind of method do we think is the most insightful for getting to the truth, but also to help the world in the science that we carry out? And what examples do we use sort of as textbooks examples? What do we think about when we think economic theory? Are we sort of focused on Wall Street and the capitalistic system, or the sort of where the money flows? Are we focused on the poor person, or what is sort of the main, what are the key examples that you would see in an economic textbook or a marketing textbook or strategy textbook? What examples are we starting from in order to sort of say these are the problems that we need to be able to solve? So it makes quite a difference if we say that we need to solve the problem of poverty versus we need to solve the problem of efficient stock markets or efficient capitalistic system. These are 2 sort of different angles of trying to go about, and can impact the way science is done. To sort of follow up a little bit on this point, so classical economics is still very much driven by, for instance, supply-demand curves and these abstract insights into how economic systems are supposed to work. The thing then is that from such a perspective on this is what economic theory is and this is the economic world that we investigate, from that perspective, if you increase the supply or increase the demand, well, vice versa, this will have an influence on the other side. I mean, they're interlinked, these 2 things. So when in the 80s and 90s evidence began to emerge that said, well, if you increase the minimum wage, you actually don't, if you increase the minimum wage, and then it should shift the demand-supply curve, but it actually turned out not necessarily to be the case. There's at least quite a bit of empirical evidence that seems to indicate that raising the minimum wage does not reduce unemployment, as it should do. So there was actually a Nobel Prize winner in economics that in the mid-80s said, it's like believing water runs uphill. Of course, raising the minimum wage will have a bad effect on the availability of jobs. It was just like, that's literally what the quote says. It's like seeing water run uphill. It's just completely impossible. So that's also why it has probably it's been difficult for people that sort of subscribe to old school economics to accept that raising the minimum wage does not necessarily lead to bad effects, because it simply goes against their fundamental paradigm, against how the economic world is supposed to function. And this is then also related to how economic science in the 60s was carried out. As you can see, it was very much theory-driven, bit of simulations, and then you might have used archival data or just data that was available from OECD or whatever sort of you could get your hands on. Very few studies where researchers went out and collected data themselves, the red stuff here. And then you look at 2011, where this data was collected, suddenly there was something like 35% of all studies actually based on economic researchers going out and collecting their own data. And so we just see a shift in the methods that I use. So again, this is a way of illustrating how the fundamental ways of doing things here in economic theory has changed quite a bit over the last 40, 50 years. So this is what Kuhn is trying to get at, that these changes are quite fundamental and sort of don't happen easily. And again, sort of small changes are easy to accept, realizing that, okay, the minimum wage should be $15 rather than $16 or whatever it should be in the American states, as in the US, as the discussion is going on right now. But sort of implementing it versus not implementing it is a big shift and can be a difficult challenge. It's like the hand washing example. Going from 25 to 30 degrees could be easy, but going from no hand washing to actual hand washing is a substantial shift in the paradigm of the given field. So Kuhn's point then is that, yes, we often do have normal science with this cumulative development, and we just build on whatever research was carried out yesterday. The paradigm is taken for granted, and it works. We can solve problems, we can improve our explanation of how the world works. Kuhn is then pointing out that sometimes we see large anomalies, where there was sort of Einstein realizing that Newton's theory of gravity wasn't perfect, or the financial crisis in 2009 that just really highlighted that there was something about the economic system that we didn't quite understand yet. We occasionally, rarely, but occasionally we see a crisis. There is an anomaly, there's something we simply cannot explain in the given paradigm that we have right now. Stuff is just happening that doesn't make any sense, just like Semmelweis hand washing example. And this then requires a paradigm change. And this is where Kuhn is then saying, we are not just building on top of research from yesterday. Semmelweis was not building on research that was done sort of the year before. He was sort of overthrowing the fundamental understanding. And this is why science in the large perspective, according to Kuhn, is not just always cumulative. Sometimes a revolution happens. And it's important to realize that and understand that, he argues, because it says something about what science is and to what degree science can be true. We'll get to that in the live session. So revolution is a reconstruction of group commitments or group beliefs. So it's a reconstruction of the paradigm of how things are done. Let me give you a few more examples. First, I want to link to this video. I won't play it here in this feed here because the sound wouldn't quite be good enough, but I can recommend going to this video here. It's just 3-4 minutes long and a quite simple but useful illustration of what a paradigm shift is. And as you can see, it's simple with some glasses and some thingies that are being put into these glasses. Watch the video. I think it might be useful. So again, Kuhn's point is that we sometimes see anomalies that are so big that we think, well, why didn't we predict this? Why can't we even explain this? Should this then maybe lead to a scientific revolution? It's not necessarily saying that this is the case. Maybe we can work it out with the existing paradigm, but he's saying that's what a crisis sometimes can lead to. When something so fundamental happens that is so unexplainable and so important, we might have to rethink, okay, is our economic scientific framework, is that actually adequate when something like this in 2008-9 can happen? But these are then also difficult to carry out, these paradigmatic changes, because how do you compare? Let's say you take this bottom example where we could go back to early 20th century or late 19th century and say, well, if we wanted to understand behavior, we would sort of look at people. That would be the fundamental assumption. If we really wanted to understand not just behavior, if we really want to understand what people are thinking and feeling, we need to look at their behavior. That was our sort of access point to the human inside. While nowadays we are, at least to some degree, able to do various kinds of MRIs or fMRIs or whatever they're called, where you can look inside the brain quite literally. And that's, of course, a fundamentally different way of trying to get data on a human being. The point here is that if this researcher from, let's say, 2021 went back to 1921 and said, look, I've got a brain scan here. This is what happens when we expose the person to, I don't know, whatever it is. We expose this person to something, and then we try to see how their brain is responding to that. I mean, this would be data that would not fit the existing paradigm. It would be very, very difficult to explain to this person from 1921 what was going on. You need this extensive training and education in order to see this kind of data. It wouldn't help. It wouldn't just be enough to say, look at this output, look at this printout. You need sort of a lot of baggage, you need a lot of education, you need a lot of training in order to make sense of scientific data. And that's a key point that Kuhn is trying to make. and then it's difficult to make any kind of direct comparison. You sort of have to shift your current paradigm into a new one in order to be able to make sense of it. So they're not straightforward to compare. And we can also make this sort of the challenge of being able to compare in a different way. So let's think about the big economic models that we have in Denmark that try to help us predict behavior. So for instance, there are economic models that are being used at various universities or in the Danish government, where they say, well, let's imagine we change the interest rate. How would that influence and change behavior in Denmark? It's important to be able to try to predict these things in advance, because it can help you sort of shed light on, should we change the interest rate or not? This is just an example. I could have used many other kinds of economic model examples. So these people that run these models, they of course try to understand and model human behavior. And the question then is, what assumptions do we make? What do we put into these models in order to be able to predict their behavior? And currently the general approach is still to say, well, use this homo economicus, the rational, all-knowing being. The moment an interest rate is changed, then these models assume that all Danes know about this change, and it is thus assumed that they would be able to change their behavior already tomorrow, because they're aware of these changes, and they respond to even very, very small changes. So quite literally, one might sort of begin to buy more expensive food in the supermarket if it's easier to borrow money. And of course, you might also buy more houses and cars, etc. So that's the assumptions that is being put into the model right now. There's another approach called an agent-based model. We don't need to sort of know the details of that, but the point is, this is a setup where you don't necessarily need to assume that everyone sort of immediately is aware of this changing interest rate. So the agents in this computer model, the human beings, so to speak, in this computer model, they don't necessarily know, but they might respond to what the neighbor does. So quite literally, the point could be, I didn't read the newspaper, so I didn't know the interest rate changed, but maybe a week from now I realize that my neighbor just bought a new car. Then I ask him, well, why did you buy this new car? It looks expensive. Well, then I might realize the interest rate changed. And in that way, it will sort of be a slower rollout of awareness of this, and this would lead to different predictions of how quickly and how much a change of interest rate would change economic behavior in Denmark. Very crude example, but sort of fits two different kinds of approaches of trying to make sense of human behavior. What assumptions are we making about the human being? But the thing is, if we were to implement the second approach here at the governmental level, well, first of all, we would need new theoretical models. We need new computer programs that have to be developed. But we also need the people that actually sort of are employed to do this at the Danish government. We need them to get a different kind of education, which means that universities also have to shift their approach. And we just need a fundamental change of practice at governmental level. And maybe it's not enough that Denmark changes. Maybe we need UN or other international organizations to change as well. So this is sort of the sociological institutional approach that Kuhn has on these paradigmatic shifts. It doesn't just require one single person to try to do something different. It can actually require a big collective of changing their approach, and who changes first. And there is a complex system. You need multiple different elements to almost change at once. And that's just not easy. This could easily take 5, 10, 15, 20 years before we get new employees at the government that are able to run these different kinds of models and these computer programs developed, and etc. Right now we just have one overall program called Adam that relies on this assumption. So again, just an example trying to illustrate that there are barriers to paradigmatic changes. This is not just something that we can easily do and engage in, and that's Kuhn's point, that this is not this is fundamental, because it goes into the essence and basic of stuff. It's not just changing the water temperature of hand washing, it's more fundamental changes. So this is the point here is trying to make, that yes, often normal science might go about in the cumulative way where we can always build on each other and we always get more clever, and we can always say theory from today is better than one from yesterday, because it's building on the one from yesterday, it's extending it. Kuhn is saying that sometimes we get such a fundamental crisis that we need to completely rethink the way that we approach the world. And it's still within sort of an overall scientific world and framework. It's still science that we do, But it's paradigmatic shifts, and he's then trying to explain why these what a paradigm is, and why these paradigmatic shifts are difficult, and why it's difficult for a person who doesn't believe in germ theory, and how this person struggles with looking at hand washing working, because how and why would it? It doesn't fit the fundamental assumptions that the field had at the given time. So this is what the concept of a paradigm is trying to do. A paradigm tells researchers what is important, what skills and training should a researcher have, what data will we collect, what do we teach in universities, what research will be accepted, what research will be funded. And so coming in as an outsider and presenting something completely different, as Semmelweis did, can be really, really challenging, because you're going against the grain, you're going against a common understanding. So theories much more easy to change. It's the fundamental paradigms that are argued to be difficult. And finally, I should really point out that when Kuhn uses the word paradigms, he doesn't use it in the same way as Gruber. So post-positivism, positivism, etc., are not paradigms in the Kuhn's kind of sense. Of course, they're related. It's about some fundamental assumptions, but Kuhn's point is about it's more closely related to the actual science we do. What assumptions does a particular researcher have in a particular discipline, about what methods we will be using, what theory we believe is true, how we make sense of, for instance, human behavior, etc. In the live session, we will then try to get an understanding of, try to get more examples of how scientific change takes place and why paradigm shifts are difficult, but also get a more sort of general perspective on what does this mean for science? How can science be true, or how can one theory be better than another if we are comparing two approaches that are just fundamentally completely different, and we don't really have a frame of reference? How can we say that a theory is true or better? This is what we will then also be getting to in the live session.